All right, we are continuing our study of the book of Genesis here on the Listener's Commentary. And in this recording, we're going to be looking at Genesis chapter 12 through 15. Now, our goal here with going through the Old Testament and the book of Genesis is not to give you all the details of these chapters. It's just impossible. One, they're big books. Two, I don't know that it's quite as necessary or helpful to give you all the little details. Really, our goal is to give you enough details and enough of a framework that you can read these Old Testament books well. And so we're going to look at Genesis 12 through 15, and because this is such a foundational section for the entire biblical story, we're going to actually slow down just a little bit and take these handful of chapters in two parts. And so part one will kind of give you an overview and significance of Genesis 12 through 15. Part two then will walk down through the text and give you some details to help understand what's going on in the text. So, where are we at as far as the context when we turn the page from Genesis 11 to Genesis 12? Well, at this point in the story, Genesis chapter 12, Abram, also known as Abraham, enters the story. And the promise to Abraham is central to the entire storyline of the Bible. So what we see here is this initial calling of Abraham, the initial promise of Abraham, and this calling and promise of Abraham gets at the origin of the nation of Israel. So we wouldn't know where Israel came from without Genesis chapter 12 and following. And it also gets at God's plan to redeem and bless all the nations. So in the flow of the story of Genesis, Genesis 1 through 11 shows the invasion of sin and death into God's good world and how sin and death then spread and permeated everything in God's good world. And then in chapters 12 and following, we begin to tell the story of God's plan to rescue and redeem and restore his world. And that plan's going to happen through an ancient Near Eastern couple named Abram and Sarai, or better known for us as Abraham and Sarah, and their seed. That word seed is really important. It oftentimes gets translated offspring or descendants, and that's a totally appropriate translation because we're talking about their offspring. But the promise won't go through all of their offspring or all of their descendants. In the course of history, that promise gets narrowed down to Isaac, and then from Isaac to Jacob, and then Jacob and his descendants, and that's going to be the line of promise. And the reason it's so important to note that the word here is literally seed, not descendant or offspring, is because the Apostle Paul plays off of this word seed in Galatians chapter 3, verse 16. And the point Paul makes in his retelling of the story of Abraham there in Galatians 3 is that eventually that promise gets narrowed down so specific and so focused onto one faithful descendant of Abraham, namely Jesus the Messiah, who is the ultimate fulfillment of the seed promise, and through whom all the other promises made to Abraham reach their culmination. And so this promise that we're going to see here is through Abraham and Sarah and their seed, their offspring. So as we turn the page to Genesis chapter 12, we're turning to a new phase in the story of the Bible and in the story of redemption. So let's just give a little bit of an overview of what goes on here. First, let's introduce the main character here, Abraham and his wife, Sarah. And so Abraham, originally named Abram, renamed Abraham by God. Sarah, originally named Sarai, but renamed by God Sarah. We'll get all of that as we walk through Genesis. But Abraham is originally from his hometown is the city of Ur of the Chaldeans. And most likely, and usually understood, it's the well-known city of Ur from southern Mesopotamia, now located in southern Iraq, right where the Persian Gulf and the Euphrates River meet. In that area, there was this wealthy, large, prosperous city known as Ur of the Chaldeans. And as far as chronology goes, if you listen to the overview of the Old Testament, we gave a basic Old Testament chronology using 500-year markers just to help us have a framework for the chronology of the Old Testament. Well, Abraham begins that chronology at 2000 BC, roughly, approximately. That's the time period we're looking at, 2000 BC. Abraham's father was named Terah, and he had two brothers who were named Nahor and Haran. And we learn from the end of chapter 11 that Haran actually died while they were still living in Ur, but Terah left Ur to go to Canaan with Abraham, Sarah, Abraham's wife, Nahor, his other son, and Haran's son, Lot. They all packed up and they headed to the northwest, and they made it as far as a city called Haran, and they settled there. Now, Haran, that city, is well known from ancient records. It's about 550 miles northwest of Ur. But it's not all the way to the land of Canaan, which was where they were supposed to be heading, which lies further to the southwest. So for some reason, they stopped short at Haran, settled there for a time, and Terah, Abraham's dad, died while in the city of Haran. That's where chapter 12 will pick up here in the book of Genesis, and God will tell Abram to pack up everything and keep heading southwest into the land of Canaan. Abraham's wife, Sarah, has not been able to have any kids, and that's a key part of the story. So as we walk through this section of the text, we need to make sure we keep that in mind. That's not just a personal tragedy. I'm sure it is that for Sarah as well as for Abraham. But it's also a family disaster. It means that there's no one to keep the family line going. There's no one to keep the clan going, to take care of the property and the household. Like what's going to happen to all the family property? What's going to happen to all the people that make up the family household? Who's going to care for all of them? That is really crucial to why having kids was so paramount in the ancient Near Eastern world. In fact, Sandy Richter, in her book, Epic of Eden, a really helpful book giving an overview of the Old Testament. But Dr. Richter points out that the father's household, the Bet Av, if you will, the father's household is the basic social unit of society. And it might actually include at times 3 generations. We actually see that with the Bet Av, the household of Terah. It's got Terah, Abraham, and Sarah, and then Lot, one of his son's sons, his grandson. So 3 generations. And when the patriarch dies, the head of the household dies, the oldest son then becomes the head of the family group. And that whole group will live together in one family grouping, helping to take care of the collective family holdings, all the land, all the sheep, all the goats, all the people that now, the servants and employees that make up the Bet Av, the household. So if Abraham has no sons, then there is no Bet Av once he dies. And all those people and all those animals are without the protection and provision of a father's household. So that's critical. So Abraham and Sarah are really in a kind of a bad situation without having an offspring, any children to take over the household once Abraham dies. And so you have Abraham, you have Sarah, his wife, and God, what we'll see in chapter 12, God calls Abraham, and he promises to bless him, to give him offspring. They don't have any, and God promises to give him offspring as plentiful as the stars are in the sky and the sand is in the desert. And he promises to give him the land of Canaan that they're supposed to go to. And he's going to give it to Abraham and his offspring. And God promises that through Abraham and his offspring, he will, this is really important, bless all the nations of the earth through them. These three promises, offspring, land, and blessing of the nations, all show up at the beginning of Abraham's story here in Genesis chapter 12. And then they get restated and reaffirmed at various points throughout Abraham's story in Genesis. In fact, just in Genesis 12 through 15, this section we'll look at in this part and next part, just in this little section, the promise of offspring and land is repeated 3 times. So as you read these chapters, watch for that because that's important. God is reaffirming and restating and recommitting himself to these promises. That repetition signals its importance. Not only that, when the book of Genesis was originally written, Moses wrote it for the people of Israel right after the Exodus from Egypt. So you got to think in that time period and those people and the original audience. And they're living nearly 600 years after the time of Abraham. And they're preparing to enter into that land of Canaan, that's the land that's been promised to their offspring and their descendants for generations. And they're going to go into that land, take that land, and do battle with the inhabitants of the land, the Canaanites, for that land. Why are they going to do that? Why are they going to enter into Canaan? Why are they going to lay claim to it? Well, the promise that God had made to Abraham gives the reason. God had actually promised to give this land to Abraham's offspring. So hearing the repetition of the land promise and how that gets restated makes sense for not only the story of the Bible and all us later readers, but it makes sense for the original audience as well. When we talk about Abraham, he's not just an Old Testament character. Abraham is so central to the biblical story that he even shows up in the New Testament as they look back to the promise to Abraham and what God said, and they explain then and retell the story of Abraham for its fulfillment in the time period of the New Testament. That's because the promise made to Abraham is the through line of the entire biblical story. So by the time we get to the New Testament, we're approximately 2,000 years after Abraham's time period, and yet the New Testament authors are recalling the story. And that's because what we see in Abraham's story beginning here in Genesis 12 sets the direction and the expectation for everything that we experience and see in the New Testament. Abraham, for example, is the pattern of faith and faithfulness. You hear that in Hebrews chapter 11, verses 8 and following, or you hear it again in James chapter 2, verse 22 and following. You hear that in Romans chapter 4, the whole chapter, as we'll look at the end of our next recording. The whole chapter is an exposition of the promise made to Abraham here in Genesis 15. We see the example of Abraham in the New Testament as the paradigm for justification by faith. That's why it's brought up in Romans chapter 4. The promise to Abraham takes precedence, Paul tells us in Galatians chapter 3, over the law and the covenant of Moses. Not because the law was bad or unimportant, but because the promise to Abraham came first and therefore is first in time and priority. We see in the New Testament that the climactic fulfillment of the promise to Abraham is Jesus, the Messiah. He is the ultimate seed of Abraham. He is the climactic and ultimate offspring. And so in our next recording, we'll look at some of the details of Genesis 12 through 15, but it's a big chunk of scripture about Abraham and Abraham's family. So let me just give you a quick overview here to wrap up part 1, and then in our next recording, we'll walk down through a few of those details. So here's an overview of Genesis 12 through 15. In Genesis chapter 12, we get God's call and promise to Abraham, and we get Abraham's obedience and entrance into the land of Canaan. So they're living in Haran at the beginning of chapter 12. God calls, God makes a promise, Abraham obeys and leaves his place of security, leaves his family home and homeland, leaves his brother Nahor and all of his relational connections and social connections, and he leaves all of that and heads into Canaan. That's chapter 12. In chapter 13, Abraham and Lot is Abraham's nephew, the son of his brother Haran. He goes with him from Haran down into Canaan, and Abraham and Lot separate in Genesis chapter 13, and they do so just because they've become so wealthy and they each have so many flocks that it's too much for them to be together in one area for feed and care for their flocks. And so they separate and they go separate directions, and then God reaffirms his promise of offspring and land to Abraham. When Lot chooses where he wants to settle in Genesis 13, he moves to the east. And that seems, as we'll talk about, to be a portent of what lies ahead for Lot. Then, in Genesis 14, Lot is captured by invading warlords, but then rescued by Abraham, because Abraham himself has become very powerful. In fact, he marshals 318 fighting men from his household. That tells you how many men were a part of his household and how wealthy of a person, of a almost sort of like a chieftain or sheik, Abraham has become. He's very powerful, very wealthy, marshals his fighting men to rescue Lot. And as Abraham comes back from that rescue of Lot, Abraham is blessed by a priest named Melchizedek and refuses any gifting or land or property from the king of Sodom because he refuses to be indebted to him. That's chapter 14. And then in chapter 15, God restates his promise to Abraham and makes a covenant with Abraham to guarantee it. So it heightens and escalates the promise. God essentially puts himself on the line with a treaty or a covenant to ensure that he will keep his promises to Abraham. That's chapter 15. So Genesis chapters 12 through 15, central to the biblical story. We have to make sure we grasp these chapters if we're going to understand the entire story of the Bible. All right, thanks for tuning into this session of the Listener's Commentary on the book of Genesis. The Listener's Commentary is a listener-supported, crowd-funded Bible teaching project that's only possible because of the generosity of dozens and dozens of people just like you. So thanks a ton for your support. And if you want to join the team of supporters, you can go to listenerscommentary.com. Click the Give button. It'll redirect you to a page, my page at World Family Mission, a registered nonprofit, where you can give a one-time donation, or you can click that little box that says Make This Monthly, and you can give a recurring monthly donation right there. All monthly donors get access to some of the bonus materials in the Study Hub, some online courses, some links to other materials and other resources as we constantly are adding more and more things there to the Study Hub. So thanks a ton for your support.